Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Elmhurst University, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to campus. We're delighted to be able to present this evening's program in partnership with the Elmhurst Public Library and the Friends of the Elmhurst Public Library. A reminder that after tonight's conversation with Dawn Turner, Dawn will be staying to sign books. So if you'd like to purchase a copy of Three Girls from Bronzeville, that book is for sale in our Spirit Shop, which is just off the hallway as you leave this area and then to the right. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's speakers. Our moderator is Dr. Andrea Krieg. She's an assistant professor of criminal justice here at Elmhurst University in our Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. Her interests include neighborhood change and race, and her research focuses on scholarship of teaching and learning, as well as examining unequal food access in communities. She earned her doctorate and master's degrees in sociology from Bowling Green State University. Dawn Turner is an award-winning author and journalist. She worked for more than 15 years as a reporter, editor, and columnist at the Chicago Tribune, and also has written commentary for the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, CBS Sunday Morning, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Tonight, and others. Dawn spent the 2014-2015 school year as a Neiman Journalism Fellow at Harvard University. In 2018, she served as a fellow and journalist in residence at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. And in 2018, she established the Dawn M. Turner and Kim D. Turner Endowed Scholarship for Media at her alma mater, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. On a personal note, I'm just so happy that Dawn can be with us this evening. Some of you may know she's a former colleague of mine, and I have been so pleased and proud to follow her career both at the Tribune and since. Her work exemplifies the best of what journalism should be. It informs, it illuminates, and it uplifts. So let's welcome Dawn Turner and Andrea Krieg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming here today. I had told you this earlier today, but I've now read the book a few times and then I finished listening to the audiobook. And in that time, I feel like each time I read it or listened to it, something new has stayed with me, right? And I think that the power of your narrative and the story is the connection that people can make. So thank you very much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Can you hear me okay? I think so. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so we're going to kind of move through in three processes. So first, just talking about how you started to write the book and why. So can you tell us more about what led you to write the book?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for coming. It's never lost on me that, we write in our own little isolated spaces, and you finish a book and you send it out into the world and you never know what's going to happen. And I'm just so honored to be here. Thank you, Desiree. Thank you, Andy, for such a careful read. This is a book that really, the story haunted me for a long time. And it started to show up in my journalism in terms of the types of stories that I was attracted to and the types of stories that I wanted to write. I wanted to write, tell stories of people who had made the most of their second chances, who had started life on one trajectory and found themselves in a place where they never imagined. And those were the stories that I pursued for the Chicago Tribune. And then I realized, because sometimes things are really right in front of your face, but you can miss it, that I wasn't just seeking their stories, but I was seeking my own story. So I started to write in bits and pieces. Spoiler alert. I wrote about Deborah for the first time in 2000 when she was on trial for murder. And then that story was very much it was a cautionary tale. back when people actually read the newspaper and they clipped out stories. It was a story that a parent or a teacher or someone could give to their, to their kid and say, don't go down this road. I wrote about her again in 2007, and that story was very much a story of transformation. She had graduated from college while in prison. It was something that she couldn't do while she was on the outside battling her addiction. But from the very beginning, Deborah was always just incredibly smart. And throughout her time in prison, people would say to her after spending really just a few minutes with her, they'd say, why are you here? Now, that's a question that could be given to anybody who's anywhere. How did you get here? And so I started to see this as a story that was foundational to my question. How did you get there? How did we all get there? And if I can go back a little bit and just talk about the book, in case you haven't read it, it's the story of three girls who start out in virtually the same place, with very similar dreams and ambitions, and wind up taking three dramatically different paths. And it's my sister Kim, my best friend Deborah, whom I just told you about, and myself, and we were coming of age in the afterglow of the civil rights movement. It was a moment when our parents believed that this country was finally amenable to giving us the opportunities that it had denied generations. We were facing so much promise. We were going to college. We were going to have great paying jobs, and we were going to become homeowners and partake of every aspect of the American dream. And so that's where the story began. And then when our paths diverged so dramatically, I wanted to understand what happened to Deborah and Kim, and why wasn't their story my story? Why wasn't my story their story? And so that's the basis of the book, just kind of this search.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you tell us more about where you got your passion for language and questioning personality?
Oh, yes, I can. I grew up in a house that's probably very similar to where many of you grew up in terms of storytelling, right? When my sister and I were little girls, we would hide under the dinner table after like a gathering. Maybe it was Thanksgiving or some holiday event, or maybe it was just a Sunday dinner. And the women would remain seated at the table and the men would go off somewhere. And we would slip under the table because at that time, my mother had formal tablecloths. And so, we would just eavesdrop. And those stories were delicious. They were so amazing. I mean, the characters that the women created. I mean, they weren't doing this because they had been taught formally to do it, but even the plots, the storylines, the people, the timing, the pacing, they were just expert storytellers. And although I went to college to become a doctor, I mean, it didn't take long before that whole the love of the story just really kind of wrapped its arms around me, because I wanted to do that. I knew that by pursuing stories, I could meet people I would never encounter, or I probably wouldn't encounter in any other way. And so in the way that the way the women spoke, the men too, but we were closer to the women, but their cadence, the use of language, it was just, it was just so colorful. And we have this in, the whole idea of code switching, where you speak a certain way in the academy or at work, but then when you relax with your girlfriends or your family members, and just the turn of phrase, it was so rich that I literally hung on their every word. And to this day, I say things that, remind my mother that she said something. My mom is 87 years old, and she still blows my mind. She's incredibly funny. She says these things. I'm like, where did that come from? But it's the writer in her, right? I mean, there is a writer in all of us. Not all of us, she didn't become a writer where she made it her career. but just the way she sees the world, where the lens tips or tilts in a certain way, was just so, it was so attractive to me. I love listening to them.
The women certainly stood out throughout the entire story for me. So can you tell us a little bit about what your writing process looks like on a day-to-day basis, or how you publish so much?
Well, the writing process is not always pretty. But it is, I said a few minutes ago that the blank page scares me. I mean, viscerally, my stomach seizes, and I have to start writing something on it. And there's almost like there's this point where the page is maybe, let's say, a quarter full or halfway full. And I'm thinking, okay, there's something here. But there is, and I think that this may be the case in a lot of professions. It's like just because you wrote an article yesterday doesn't necessarily mean that you can write another one the next day, or just because you wrote a book a year ago. At least for me, it all feels incredibly new. And so, but the thing that I have that I think works, that works for me to my advantage, is that I do have the discipline. I will get there in front of the computer every morning and grind it out. I will work as hard as I possibly can. And I mean, to the point where my daughter, when she was little, she would come into my home office and she would just look at me, and I would just be staring at the computer, and she would say, "You're writing, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, what a child." She gets me. She really gets me.
Wonderful. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to share such a personal story, right? Your story, your family's story, the trauma and joy, and not only did you write the memoir, then you've welcomed people to ask questions like me, like our audience. And so what has that experience been like?
Well, it's really wonderful, people like you who really read the book and who really, get it, and you have these amazing questions. It's not easy. So I had to, as I said, I realized that this was a story that I pursued in various forms of journalism, but it also pursued me. And so I had to get to the point where I did think it was a story that could be shared broadly, because I had told our story. I had never written about my sister in the pages of the Chicago Tribune, but I had written about Deborah, and she had given me permission to do that. And so when we sold the book in 2018, my agent sold it, and it was interesting because there was quite a bit of interest, which I didn't expect. I hoped for, but I was just like, okay, if it happens, it happens. But we went with the editor. It's huge if you have one editor who's interested, but when you have several, that's like amazing. But we chose the editor who really got the story. And one of the things that she wanted me to do, and when I say she got the story, is that she knew that I was a journalist. So I could tell it, if I told it solely as a journalist, it would have this kind of antiseptic, distant quality to it. So she wanted me to be able to do this kind of dance where I put my journalism hat on, and then I take it off, and then I put it on. And that was, it was challenging. And so whenever the whole book was challenging because it was personal, and it was deeply personal. Sure. But to have an editor who could guide you, and someone who was very, such a careful reader, but also could give criticism that was incredibly helpful and constructive, that was, that made writing such a difficult book easier, because not one part of it was easy. Sure. But it was, just having her say that we needed to keep in mind that this was a story about 3 girls. So it wasn't a story about 2 girls. And I really didn't want this to be a story about, that one girl did everything perfectly and the other 2 kind of didn't, because that's never the case. Nobody's perfect. And I wanted it to be like a braid, where you had these 3 strands, and we braided it together, because that's how we were as people. that we were very different, but they were the loves of my life. And, and so that kind of, where you could get just completely angry at somebody and what they've done, but you embrace them because you love them and you are going to go the distance. So all of that, I wanted that to come through the book.
So thinking about your role as a journalist, right, you had done a ton of extra work, right, to kind of fact check your memories and things like that.
Right.
And so I assume you've learned a lot about your family through this process. And so what has changed for you?
There's a point in the book where I write about talking to my father, because my father and I had pretty fraught relationship, and so I wanted him to be seen as a whole person and not just a person who had a really bad night and did something completely awful. And that was attack my mom. And so part of that the journalist in me could interview him in a way the daughter in me could not. And so I was so grateful for that time in 2004, where I got a chance to interview him. My pen is my sword and my notebook is my shield. And that was the way I saw journalism. And that's how I practiced journalism in terms of wherever I went. And I felt, so much more emboldened to go and ask people questions that I wouldn't necessarily ask. But that time with him was was special because, and it was brought about because he had a heart attack. And I had this reckoning, this moment where I felt like, oh my God, if I lost him, we'd always kind of been at each other. Well, I mean, it was just a fraught relationship. But I felt like if I had so many questions, and if he passed away, I wouldn't have that opportunity to ask him. I would be talking to people who knew him. And so I spent those weeks, those Friday nights with him and got a chance to learn more about him. The journalist in me also, I mean, I had Deborah's story about what happened on the night when Raymond Jones died, but I had to look at the court records. And that was close to 700 pages. And I went through every one, because that's what I would have done if I were covering a story of anybody else for the Tribune. But I wanted to engage those journalism muscles and go through all of that. I interviewed the judge who sentenced her, and the judge 20 years later remembered her case because he said that there were so many people who had come before him on charges that related to drugs. But her case was so memorable because she had so many family members in not the audience, but in the courtroom,
the gallery.
Gallery, thank you. There that day. And so he remembered her, which is a sad commentary on, I mean, people who are so enmeshed in addiction that, and it makes sense. I mean, it's hard to deal with someone who's addicted. But the judge remembered her. I interviewed police officers. On my side, I interviewed my sister's friends and our family members, and people who knew her in ways that I didn't. And so because I wanted it to be, our memories are fraught, and so I wanted this to be a story that was reported, that was the journalism hat. But then when I took off that hat, I still had to tap into my own humanity. And that was where when the emotions came in, because as a journalist, it's not professional to sit and cry. I mean, I've interviewed people mothers and fathers who have lost their children. And as much as I might want to cry with them in that moment, I can't do that. But it was that combination with my own story of knowing when to do that dance of being more objective and standing back and just leaning into all of that stuff.
As I was reading my most recent version, I would say, of it, I was really struck by those conversations that you had with your dad. My dad passed away a month ago. And so, right, just thinking through like what you would give to be able to have those conversations and to understand the history of family members, right? And just reading about your dad and his background with the like sharecroppers and how his dad and your had owned property and really was trying to help and things like that. And I just thought that was such a rich like discussion.
Oh my God. Yeah. And I was able to, my grandfather was much older as I guess he would have been technically my great grandfather at that age, but he was an older dad. I think it was like a second marriage or something. But just that he bought 160 acres in the Jim Crow South was huge. And I got the deed with his signature. And that, again, that was part of the research, but to know that he owned a Model T Ford and was threatened and was told not to drive it because he could buy a car that other people in the county or whatever couldn't, that he had sharecroppers, but he wanted the system to work the way it was supposed to work and not having people actually owe more money at the end of the season than they started with. So all of that stuff, learning, and also learning how my father felt about his father. Which was just such a, there's so many contradictions in all of our lives. But I just, and also, I mean, it was just all that time with him. At the time, I had no idea how important it would be, but I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah, and being able to have that information to reflect back on and pass on to Hannah, it just sounds wonderful. How did your family receive the book overall?
Oh, that's a great question because and this is, again, the journalist in me. I mean, there are times when I wrote about people for the Tribune when I would let them read, especially if I was the one who initiated the conversation, if I said, okay, I want to write about you, I want to tell your story. And I would let them read the column or the story or sections or something before it went in the paper because I understand what things look like in print. Right. I mean, so even when people say, oh, you can tell that, they grant you the permission, I wanted to use my judgment, especially with my mom, because I didn't want her to see something that she gave me permission to use, but to see it in print and then feel differently about it. Everybody whose name I used, that was the actual name, I gave them a copy of the book, a copy of the manuscript before I gave it to my editor. And what I had was those little Post-its in sections where their name, every place where they were, so that they could, if they didn't want to read the whole manuscript, but I gave it to them. But if they wanted to just flip through where they were mentioned in the sections where they were, so that was my mother. It was Deborah, it was her sister Darlene, because I wrote about their parents. And so even though Deborah gave me permission to tell her story, I still wanted Darlene to give me permission as well, and for her to be fine about it. Deborah's victims' family, I gave the victims copies of the manuscript. There are times if you give the editor, and this is the journalist in me. I mean, sometimes if you give the editor the book, before, or the story before you let people see it, then there may be this little gem in there that like, oh, that's a great part, let's keep that in. And so I circumvented that by giving everybody the book first, and then I gave it to my editor because I didn't want there to be any surprises. And I'm really happy to say that when the book went from hardcover to the paperback, we made no changes. And sometimes there are a lot of people make a lot of changes because there are errors or whatever. But I wanted to do like my due diligence on the front end to make sure that people, that they were happy with it. And they had full, if there was something that they saw and didn't want in there, I was going to take it out.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So as a woman who's in a family of all women, as I was reading and thinking about after dinner and the conversations that are happening and the men left the room, and my family would say there's a lot of Rizzarello happening in the room, right? Like that's our phrase for it. It seemed like the women in your life were like complete rocks for you. Yeah. Not to say that men weren't influential as well, right? But the book is about sisterhood. Yes. And it's about the three of you and also your moms, fundamentally, right. Mrs. Streisand and your mom. And so can you speak more about sisterhood and how it's influenced you and your life?
Yeah, it's and when I talk about this, my daughter, who is an only child, she kind of like gets a little huffy because she didn't have a sibling. But they were incredibly, and they still are influential. My mom is just a rock. She is, and that's you think a writer would come up with a better word. But she is just she's amazing. And not only is she my mom, but she literally saved my child's life. And so I just, and my mother and my daughter now are, I mean, best friends. They're like 60 years apart, but they are incredibly close. My grandmother played a huge role in my life. My aunt, and the women were incredibly influential, but I also wanted to make sure that the men, as you said, I mean, that the men showed up. I mentioned earlier Brian, why can't I think of his last name? Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy. And he always says that we are not the worst thing that we've ever done. And I think of that in terms of Deborah, but I also think of it in terms of my father. And that in the book, I mean, yes, very complicated. But I wanted him, and that's one of the things that the conversations I hope did, was that it rounded him out beyond a stereotype. I was always told I had, you know, when I was a kid, I had great test scores, great grades, and I got to college and flunked out. I like to say they invited me to leave. But it was the dean, one of the University of Illinois in Champaign, one of the first Black deans there. He was furious with me. But I flunked out because he was like, you know, at orientation, they tell you got to do X, Y, and Z, and I did nothing. And I protested apartheid, but I did not do my schoolwork. But he was furious, and so I had him on one end, and my future father-in-law, who I got the letter saying that I had to leave, you know, sit out for a year after my freshman year, and I took the letter over to James Trice. I took it to his house. David came to pick me up, my former husband, and I took the letter to him, and then I said, well, they said that the letter is non-negotiable, and he said, Dawn, everything is negotiable. You may not get exactly what you want, but everything is negotiable. And so as a man in my life, he was huge. Dean Copeland gave me a hard time, which I deserved. I graduated in 4 years. It was on the dean's list several times. And at the end, I hugged him because he let me sit out a semester rather than a year. That was that kind of, didn't get to come back that first semester of sophomore year, but came back second semester, finished on time. And so that was huge for me. It was a huge lesson. I mean, I would not, if I had to change my college experience, I would not change that, because it really made me determined that I would never, ever have anybody invite me to leave, because I did not do what I was supposed to do. So I wanted the men to shine as well.
Of course. So thinking about Mr. Trice and Dean Copeland, there's parts throughout the book where you're very savvy and rely on other people for information. Like, you recognize that you might not have that social capital or that information, but you used your networks in ways that I think maybe Deborah and Kim weren't doing so, right? Whether it was getting into the high school program that your friend was in, or Mr. Trice saying, like, no, you go back down there and tell them and negotiate. And as a professor, right, can you tell us more about what it was like being a first generation student, maybe not having access to that social capital, noting that your mom
went to college?
Yes, your mom went to college, and she makes that clear to you. And so is the first 4-year graduate.
Yeah, people ask me, well, what was the difference between Deborah, Kim, and I? And I always like to say, well, they were a little bit more daring than I was. I mean, for me, rules were scaffolding. And so I loved kind of knowing where the boundaries were. I was not a perfect kid, but I did not like the edge. Right. I mean, I did not want to go over the edge. And so that was something that was, I think, a difference. And the other difference was that I wanted to surround myself with people who were as smart as me or smarter than me. And just like, I mean, you were referring to my friend Thomas, who is still one of my best friends, but he was a smart kid. And we competed, and it was a very healthy competition, and I realized that he was in this program at our school. We went to a magnet school, but there was a special program beyond that magnet program where we spent 3 days a week at the University of Chicago taking these advanced classes. And I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me about that? And he's, and then I remember filling out all of the papers to do it. I got my mom to sign it. And I got into that program. That's actually how I met David, who would become my husband. But it was just that I was able to use a network, and it wasn't something that we, the whole networking and who are your people. That wasn't something. I think it was a little bit more intuitive. The other thing that I had in my head was like a vision board, right? And so I did not have a vision board that we would think of today. But I remember my teacher saying, you should go to college, which was really ironic given my first year. But you have to go to college. And so I wanted to be hanging out with those kids who were headed in that direction.
So I want to turn it back to your mom a little bit. And throughout, I'm struck by your observations of your mom and kind of things you think she did kind of right or wrong. And at one point you talk about how you're going to parent in a totally different way. And as a parent of a 3-year-old, I laughed out loud because we all think that that's going to happen. And so given that you have had time and motherhood for a lot longer, how has that changed how you think about your mom?
My mother saved my child's life. And I mean that in that's not a metaphor at all. It's a very literal way, because Hannah was sick in a way that we did not understand. And so initially I thought that, that parents have complete agency over their children. And I learned that what we had with Hannah was that she just happened to be a kid who was similar to her parents. I don't know how I would have parented a child who was like Deborah or who like Kim. I mean, God bless them, they were beautiful people, but they were far more rambunctious and, again, pushing against authority. And so parenting works in theory when you have to put it into practice. So I just came to admire her even more than before, because she not only did she save my child, but she saved me in terms of, Hannah had pneumococcal meningitis that could have just terrorized her brain. And we got very lucky in that she's fine. But at that point, when she did start to heal, I almost had her in this hermetically sealed bubble. And my mother told me, this was not your fault, but it will be your fault if you prevent her from thriving because you're afraid something like this is going to happen again. And so she helped me on so many different levels to be a better parent, but to, this whole parenting thing is it is no joke. It's the greatest gift that you'll ever have. But at the same time, as we all know, it's the hardest.
Yep. Yep, definitely. Reflecting on another kind of mother-daughter relationship, I was struck by Mrs. Trice, right? We meet her at your elementary school. And often when we have these discussions about kids kind of going down the wrong path, it's always, where are the parents? Where are the parents? And that's problematic in itself. But in this case, right, Mrs. Trice kind of was there, right?
Right.
She was at the elementary school. She moved Deborah to Indianapolis to try and remove her. Can you speak more to their relationship? Because it's kind of sitting in the background a little bit throughout the book.
Well, both of her parents, I mean, my parents divorced when I was young, but Deborah's parents were very much together. And so, you know, there are these stories where kids, I mean, they break my heart, because there are stories about kids who kind of come out of the womb and they are destined to this life of half wattage, right? I mean, that they are just, I mean, you know, they're living in these really troubled circumstances. That was not Deborah's story, and it wasn't Kim's story. You know, people have asked me, do I feel guilt or regret? I mean, I think that I couldn't help them. I think, and I absolutely do feel that, and I have forgiven myself some for that, for whatever I could not do. But they also made it incredibly difficult for us, the people who love them, to help them. And I say that with a lot of love. I mean, they just did. And so both of Deborah's parents tried incredibly hard. When Deborah's father died, and it was just Deborah's mother and her mother-in-law, they were going to mortgage their house to get her into like an in-clinic treatment center, because the outpatient ones were said to not be as effective. And so they wanted her in an inpatient center. And she said, no, don't do this. Because she said, I can do it. I can fight this. And she couldn't. But I mean, they tried so hard. And it just, you know, I mean, Deborah's mother said to me, and Deborah's mother passed away in, I believe, 2016, but I remember her saying that it hurt her heart that someone had to die. But she knew where her daughter was. And I mean, to have that as a trade-off was incredibly difficult. But she was happy to know where Deborah was.
So we just have a couple more minutes, so just some kind of ending questions for you. Bronzeville obviously is a core component of this story, and growing up in Bronzeville and the representation that you saw within Bronzeville. And so questions about, have you been back recently and what's changed? And also reflecting on the fact, right, that kind of public housing was at its prime when you were coming up, and right, there was this glow to everything after the civil rights era, and then there was disinvestment in all of these changes. And so how do you think kids fare today
in that same neighborhood?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of kids are doing really well because the community has changed. The public housing projects were demolished as part of the city's plan for transformation. And so you don't have the buildings there. But so what happened to the people? And that becomes that's like an extension to that question. And so buildings are in and of themselves are not necessarily bad. They're not bad actors. It's what happens to are the properties kept up? And that was the problem with the Ida B. Wells homes. So I guess I have been back there, and it looks very different without the public housing. And you have to remember that was an area where there was just so much public housing, just concentrated in this zip code, and not just in our area, but along 35th Street, along State Street with Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens. And so you had just had too much there, too much entrenched poverty, but you also had places that were just woefully maintained. And so all of the buildings are gone. You have these old brownstones that were just that had fallen on just horrible disrepair when we were kids are now selling for $1 million because they've been renovated. You've got people walking dogs, and you've got a lot of the place where, and these historic markers that highlight, Gwendolyn Brooks lived there, and Richard Wright and Louis Armstrong, and so many different people. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, the first heart surgeon to perform an open heart surgery, not the first Black, but the first surgeon. And so it really is pushing the history and promoting the housing stock. And it's not perfect. No place is perfect, but it's changed. And Deborah and I were there together earlier in the year. She happened to be in Chicago. She's like, let's go to the old stomping grounds. And we kind of like stand outside and point up to our old windows.
Can you tell us more about where everyone is currently?
Oh yeah, that would be great. I can tell you that Deborah is doing incredibly well. And I have to give credit to the Indiana women's prison system because they did a wonderful job of preparing her to leave. But even before that, it's one of the few places, prisons in this country do such a horrible job of rehabilitation, much better at warehousing. And so that's why the recidivism rates are incredibly high. But for her, she took advantage of every program there. She's got a great job. She's actually in the process now of buying a house, which is huge. And I am so proud of her. David is doing really well. He and I are the best of friends. And I don't know who.
Your mom.
Oh, Mom. Yeah, don't tell her I forgot her. As I said, Mom is 87 years old. She's battling cancer, but from the very beginning, we were told that it was a highly treatable cancer. It's multiple myeloma, which is why I'm still masking, just so that you guys know, because I don't live with her, but I help out as much as I can, and I want to be incredibly safe for her. So, and Raymond's family, Deborah's victim's family, they have a foundation. It's an anti-gun violence foundation. And guess who's one of the board members? Deborah. They not only embraced her, if you read the book, there was a reconciliation chapter. They embraced her in 2018, and that has not stopped.
They're amazing.
They are.
I couldn't process that entire part. What about Hannah?
Hannah's doing really well. Yeah, and that whole COVID thing when people come home and don't leave, and so I'm trying to kick her out. But she's a beautiful human being. I mean, she's got issues. She's my child. She's got issues. But it's great. I love her.
That's good.
Yeah, I do. I love her as a person, and I love her because I have to.
So what's next for you? I heard a little bit about a book. I heard a little bit about a film adaptation. What can you tell us?
Well, what can I tell you? That I am writing a book. The next book is a novel. And so that whole thing about truth and chasing down facts, and I'm still doing a lot of research, but it's not personal. And so the book, the deadline is in January, so I'm working toward that. I absolutely love the book. I believe it's the best thing I've ever written. And I feel like I can say that because for some reason I've had like this out of body experience. It's the writing. It's not me. It's the writing there, which is, I just love the story. And that's all I could say.
Nothing on a film adaptation?
It's interesting. There was a lot of film interest, but it's always it's so romantic to think of having the book adapted. There was also some interest in terms of I think it was The Good One or Steppenwolf, but to have something on stage as well. But I just decided that this story, seeing it in a book is very different from seeing it on the screen.
Sure.
And I wasn't certain that I wanted it on the screen. And nobody else fought with me regarding that. But with this novel, I want it everywhere. So Yeah.
We'll do another reading group of it. Yeah.
We can hang out again. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're gonna move into our Q&A.
Yes.
We'll do some questions from the audience. Andy's gonna help me with that.
Okay.
So, the best way to do this, I think, the question we're gonna ask you to come out to the aisles, and we'll grab you there.
Yay.
Good question. Okay.
Oh, here, just so everybody can hear.
I loved your book.
Thank you.
I stayed up till like 1 a.m. to finish it. I wanted to finish it before I came here, but anyway, we're in a book club. We're gonna read the book next month.
Oh.
I don't know if you live in the area. We have our book club at Francesca's.
And where's Francesca?
Downtown Elmhurst.
Oh, downtown
Here.
Elmhurst.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if you have it. No, but I'm serious. I would
Okay.
love it. Now she's like, she sends this out and she's like, okay, oh my God, she's gonna be here. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta go. And we're like, here. And I'm like, and now can you make better directions to find this place, please? But
Okay.
the question I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
and I'm from Chicago. I'm a little bit older than
Uh-huh.
you, not too
No.
much. But enough.
Well, there are few people older than me.
But the thing I wanted to ask, I can ask you a million questions.
Yeah.
Probably not, no one knows. But the thing I wanted to ask you was with your mom and the college.
Mhm.
And when your mother pulled you aside and said, I went to college.
Right.
How did you feel?
Oh, incredibly humbled. I felt like I had hurt her feelings. Sad, devastated because that wasn't my intention. But yeah, that was incredibly hard. But at the time, of course, I didn't mean anything by it. But I knew that she had gone to at the time it was Kennedy King, but it was called something else. But anyway, yeah, that was very difficult. Thank you for asking.
In reading your book, I kept thinking, what an amazing memory.
Yeah.
I wondered if you kept a journal or a diary as at that age that you referred back to.
Yeah, I did. And I have at the beginning of the book an author's note where I said that I did. I mean, I had not just I had journals and diaries, but I also had letters. I had letters from Deborah throughout her time in prison, but I also had letters from my sister. Right before she died, The Color Purple had come out, and that's a book of letters. And so she and I mean, she loved The Color Purple. And so she and I sent letters back and forth. And then there's always the moment in a letter where you go, remember when. But in addition to the letters and journals and the documents, I interviewed classmates, I interviewed teachers, as I said, the judge, attorneys, police officers. So I wanted, and that's the research part of it, that I wanted to make sure that I could not rely on my memory, but I wanted to get people to tell a story. And then what I did was, when people said the same thing, I kind of saw that as being the truth. And then I was able to craft scenes from that. Thank you.
Right here. Right here, Desiree.
First of all, thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thank you.
My question is, you told so many brutal things about your father, the one horrible incident, and then the pettiness of like skipping graduation. Right. Yet for me, you made me really care about him and want the relationship to really go well. How do you think you achieve that? Because it's almost like a magic trick.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. But I think that we as human beings, we are magic tricks, right? I mean, we're complicated. I mean, there are things we do well, and there are things we don't do well. I knew that my father was someone, yes. I mean, he was petty in that he did not come to the graduations. But when I was assaulted as a girl, my mother said to my sister, you cannot tell your father this because he is incredibly protective and it will not end well. So I always felt safe around my father. I mean, I knew that, and when we would go and visit him at his job, and if men were speaking in a certain vernacular or something, and they'd be like, oh no, those are Mr. Turner's kids. You have to respect them. So it is, we all have these complicated family members, and I wanted to, as I said earlier, I wanted him to be more than just that moment and more than a stereotype. So thank you for that question.
He's really easy to talk to.
The scene that touched me so was that your sister funeral,
Yes.
and your mom and your grandma and your aunt standing in front of the casket.
Yeah.
I mean, that made me cry, and I just envisioned that. That was very beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was incredible. It was incredibly difficult to write. And so part of my process when I had to write scenes like that, and there weren't, I mean, that was clearly that scene, but I could not write that alone. I love being in my own little cocoon and writing, you know, I don't need anybody in my space, but I needed to be surrounded in writing those scenes. Thank you. Oh, hold on.
Could you say that again?
Did you decide on the name for your new book?
Not quite. Not yet. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. I was incredibly impressed with how brave you were in writing this book and telling those stories. I was a journalist too for many years, worked in news for a long, long time. And I can't imagine telling my story, my own story, with the honesty that you did yours. How did you get over that hurdle, or was it a hurdle for you at all?
It was an enormous hurdle, but I wrote a column for the Chicago Tribune for a while, and that was me giving my opinion, right? And so that was the beginning of me, you know, kind of, as they say, putting myself out there, and so, but clearly that still was not me telling my own personal stories. But one of the things that I had to do in writing the book is that I didn't want this to be, as I said earlier, a story about one perfect girl who tells a story of the other two girls who did wrong things. I wanted each of us to be complex, and my editor helped me with that. And so part of my complexities is telling my stories and the things that some things nobody ever knew because I never told anybody. But if I had to, and that's why you have to be somewhat delusional to say you're going to write a memoir, because you really don't know how exacting it is and how much it's going to take to just be, because as I said, I wanted there to be equal weight, and I wanted us to be rendered in a way that was very honest and open.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you. There's someone here. Come in.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm here with my book club of 17 years, about
Whoa.
17 years. We're getting together for drinks afterwards. But I connected with your book on a few levels. I grew up in Chicago, went to CPS High School, Taft High School.
Okay.
I also went to U of I, a little bit behind you.
Okay.
Spent time in Lincoln Hall.
Oh, I was an RA in Lincoln Hall.
You were?
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, Trelease, right? No, that's a different.
Lincoln
No,
on the quad.
okay, got it. Okay,
Yeah.
yep.
Married my college sweetheart. Kind of like you, it didn't work out. We grew apart, similar to you and David. So I am here to ask you a nosy question.
Yeah.
Do you have somebody in your life now?
Oh. Oh, that's cute.
My students wanted to know too. Don, all of the students also wanted to know about
I
that.
wanted to know that.
And I was like, I'm not gonna
yeah.
be the one to ask.
Oh, okay.
So thank you.
Yes, I will just say I do. Thank you.
So you piqued our interest in the fact that you have a novel coming out, but you didn't give us even one iota of an idea about what it's about.
I know, and I can't. I'm afraid to say it out loud. You know, it's actually not really early because I'm 16 chapters in, but I have to say I love it, and I'm the last person to love anything I write until I do. But I do. I love the story, and that's all I can say. That's a little bit of an iota, but thank you.
between when you write?
Oh, I'm sorry.
How much time between when you're done and then when it's on the bookshelves?
Oh, it's a year. It takes the book birthing process. It takes about a year. So I will turn the book in January. It may be February, but it'll be a year after that, and then it depends on what's going on, a year later. So it could be that it's not a good time next, February of the next year, which would be 2025 or whatever. I mean, I know that I would not want to put out a book next fall during the election. So it's all in timing, and the marketing crew and all of those people, the editor, they will decide a lot of that.
Can I ask, my students have a question for you?
Oh,
Just briefly. We've talked a lot about David. They
yeah.
won't ask you, so I'm asking for you. We've talked a lot about David and kind of like his role throughout everything, right? That there's like this sisterhood within the mom and you guys, and he's always there as a support person. But can you speak more about kind of what was he thinking when you would come home from different things?
Well, it's funny because David is still one of the funniest people I know. I mean, he's brilliant. He's one of those people who, she's just super, super smart. And so he told me that he thought the title of the book should be 3 Girls and David. Yeah. I'm like, no, David. As a kid would be Calvin. You guys remember Calvin and Hobbes? Yeah, I mean, that is David. And so, I mean, he is still one of my biggest cheerleaders. He's one of my biggest supporters, and he's my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned this earlier that his girlfriend, whom I adore, had me over to her place because her book club read my book. And I mean, just sitting and hanging out with her, I loved her friends, and it's the marriage just didn't work out. But, and again, as I said in the book, it wasn't, there are obvious deal breakers like an affair. And even that's not a deal breaker sometimes, but, or somebody, the money, have different philosophies regarding money or goals or whatever. And we didn't have any of that. There was no abuse, or it is so hard to explain because typically, and this is really funny, whenever I'm when I've talked to older Black women, like Black women around my mother's age, they're always like, baby, what happened? I was like, what happened? And they want me to just really nail something down. And it's so much more complicated. Sure. That's another book that I'm not going to write.
Yeah, I have a question about the book.
Yes.
So you mentioned that your sister and Deborah were both more risk takers.
Yeah.
And in some environments, that's a very positive attribute.
Absolutely.
So what else is there that would have drawn them to addiction or to another direction?
Well, I think that, at least for my sister, and I can't necessarily pinpoint it. Well, actually, Deborah did tell me that, even though her father was so adamant about, don't do drugs, that she never thought that crack was going to be addictive. And of course, it's one of the most highly addictive drugs that you can take. But Deborah, that's that, bless her heart, it's the Superman in her. And my sister really succumbed to alcoholism after she lost her baby. And so, so one of the things that I always like to make clear is that I do believe that their story could have been my story could have been their story. And I do believe there, but for the grace of God, go I. Because you can try to do as many things right as you can. And it is a myth that you will absolutely land where you thought you would. I have to tell you that when my child at 14 months old got sick, if we had lost her, I have no idea where I would be. So there are things that happen in our lives, things that befall us, that we think we know how we are going to handle it, but we don't know until that thing happens. And I'm so grateful that I did not have, she's fine. And so that's why when I meet people, and I've written about people who are at their lowest point, I have to give them the benefit of the doubt, because I don't know the road that took them, that led them to that place. And it's really important for me not to just see them as a type, but to let them be who they are and to speak in their own voice, in their own cadence, because they are, as Brian Stevenson said, they are more than the worst thing that they have done. And I believe that wholeheartedly of each of us. I mean, I've been the beneficiary of forgiveness and, of grace many times. And I'm grateful for that.
We have time for one more question.
This is kind of funny. I'm a little bit
Okay.
embarrassed to ask, and because it is personal, but because you've had Kim and Deborah, when you love someone and they're having difficulties, like to make it through, besides like the sisterhood, like, did you have therapy or,
Oh.
I mean, honestly, to get through something like this, and I know sometimes in different cultures don't believe in therapy.
Yeah, there was a time when, therapy just wasn't a thing. Because even when my sister lost her child, there was, like now, anybody who's going through that, I would absolutely recommend therapy. Growing up, therapy was a church. We were in church several times a week. And so that was something that kind of helped us grounded. I did not do therapy regarding Kim and Deborah, but I highly, highly recommend it, especially with someone who's the right therapist, to be able to have a conversation. I've been very lucky in that I have friends and family members who just allow me to bend their ear from time to time. And I try to reciprocate, because I understand, especially, we look at what you read, you open the newspaper now, you click on something and you read stories now, and they're enough to kind of just double you over. And so to have that community of people that you can check in on and who check in on you, that is priceless. And that is what I've been very, very, throughout my life, very, very fortunate to have. And I try not to, as a kid, you take that stuff for granted. You're like, mom's there, dad's there, or uncle, somebody. And, but now I look back and I realize just how fortunate we are to have had that. And I believe that Deborah is thriving now in part because of that. The stage was always set. She didn't have to build it. It was there. She just had to step onto it. And she has.
Let's thank Dawn Turner for.